Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Town and Gown. It's great to see another very fine turnout this evening. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, this Town and Gown session is in association with Decisions, as some in the past. Great Decisions, for those of you who don't know about it, is associated with the Foreign Policy Association, and it's been run here at People's Church for some years. And Professor Graham, who has kindly agreed to speak with us this evening, I think has previously spoken to this group. So it's great to have them involved in Town and Gown and to see Professor Graham here again. One last thing from me before we get things underway. I'd like to introduce Taz Amin, who will be moderating Town and Gown this evening. Taz is a current freshman at Michigan State. She's a member of the Social Science Scholars Program, and a very fine one at that. She's majoring in social work and minoring in cities, environment, design, and society. So thank you, Professor Graham, and over to you, Taz.
Hi all, it's so nice to see the turnout that Dr. Waller has said beforehand. I'm going to introduce Dr. Graham. So Dr. Graham is a professor of international relations at MSU's James Madison College of Public Affairs. He also serves as the director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the university. Professor Graham's interests include international security and economic relations, international organization, Central and Southeastern Europe, and Central and South Asia. He has taught at Columbia University and led the Yale University Seminar on International Business. He has also served as a research associate with the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the Futures Group. The author of many books, Dr. Graham recently published, along with other MSU faculty, Making Russia and Turkey Great Again, Putin and Erdogan in Search of Lost Empires and Autocratic Power. We're very, very excited to have you, Dr. Graham, and you can take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Happy to be here today. I hope I can answer some questions that may be on your minds given the state of world events. Let me just correct one thing, if I may, Taz. I was director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies until last week. So now it's ably being directed by my former associate director there, Vladimir Tarabera, who probably should be giving this talk too in some ways. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering, and he's now the director, and he's originally from Ukraine. So he's probably got some views to say. Maybe you can get him later on in the semester. Anyway, I'm going to work through this book a little bit and then try to bring it up to the present with the challenges we face in relation to Russia's policy towards Ukraine and the possible threat of an invasion. Let me just start out with the arguments that are presented in the book. I should mention that my colleagues, Folke Lindahl, who's a retired professor of political theory and constitutional democracy at James Madison College, and Timur Kocaoglu, who was for years also associate director of the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and is someone who splits his time between Turkey and the US and has been both of them have been very important in different ways to the actual book. So let's see if I can make this work. Okay. So the argument, essentially we argue that the fragility of democracy is clear in the post-Cold War cases of Russia and Turkey. Putin and Erdogan began their rule as the result of fair electoral success and build a popular following after some important policy initiatives to reclaim or restore order and extend benefit. In each case, there was a struggle with culture and tradition perhaps what we call the persistence of authoritarianism and its acceptance to some degree in both countries, as well as difficult economic and political challenges. Both leaders have ambition to restore their countries to international prominence, indeed recover lost empire to some extent, while at the same time, they both seek to ensure that domestic challenges to their growing political power were negated. Both have been largely successful in the latter, at least in the short to medium term, but have been less successful in the former. Thus far, there have been serious limitations in building international power and regional stability. Both have contributed to increased instability in their neighborhoods and have stimulated some responses from real and potential adversaries that might suggest recklessness, perhaps with unintended consequences for their own security postures. Now I'm going to be focusing mostly on Russia today. Perhaps we could do a later talk with Timur on Turkey if there's any interest in doing so. Putin and Erdogan also face substantial challenges in building dynamic economies and broad-based prosperity. They risk stagnation or decline at best and catastrophic collapse at worst. Both have had opportunities to remake their political economies to meet the needs of their broad populations, as well as to contribute to regional order. But I would argue both have squandered them in favor of personal wealth and power gain and the desire to control their own personal political security. Now, is this startling? I think it's probably the way most of us look at Russia and Turkey, but perhaps there's some elements of this that will raise some questions that may be interesting towards the end. Perhaps it's not startling, but our judgment seems to hold up maybe even more today than it did a year ago when we finished writing the book. The Russia-Ukraine crisis is interesting, at least to us from this perspective. Also, the fragility of democracy and the persistence of authoritarianism, which actually was our former title for the book, are hard to question even in Western societies these days. So let me back up for a minute and point out a couple of books that I think are interesting in these times and perhaps provide a starting point for us. There's a book by Richard Hawes, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, entitled A World in Disarray. And he's writing prior to the Trump presidency, actually, suggesting that the post-war world of order, to some extent, has gone into disruption or disarray, and that the institutions that we've come a long way to accept and regard with some normality are threatened. And he says it's really not that different from the period between 1919 and 1939, the period that E.H. Carr wrote about so vividly in the 20 Years Crisis. In his view, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, comparing some statements made by Yeats in the 1920s and of course E.H. Carr. The rules, policies, and institutions that have guided the world since World War II have largely run their course. Respect for sovereignty alone cannot uphold order in an age defined by global challenges from terrorism, the spread of nuclear weapons, to climate change and cyberspace. Great power rivalry is returning. And he calls for a new world order, a 2.0, which reflects the reality that power is widely distributed now and that borders count for less. There's no easy cure, and we've been going in the wrong direction in the last several years. This was speaking in 2016, so I think he'd probably say it's even worse now. The EU was weakened, but NATO challenged and perhaps revitalized. The impact of Trump is important here, I think. There is some effort in institution building in other parts of the world. For example, Putin's Eurasian Economic Union is interesting, but is not really a organization of democracies or prosperous market economies, and it's an immature alternative. What about China's Belt and Road Initiative? Is that the wave of the future in some sense? And its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there's another book that I'd draw your attention to, which I think is interesting in this regard, and that's Robert Kagan's book, The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. He argues that our belief in the inevitability of progress and the end of history has been an illusion. The freedom, prosperity, and general peace the world has enjoyed for decades are threatened today by natural and eternal forces of human nature, and the international system that, like a jungle, constantly seek to undermine and overwhelm all that we have accomplished. Those who argue for accepting the world as it is have no idea that that the world really looks like, what the world really looks like, how dangerous things can get, and how quickly they can fall apart. In his view, the historical norm has always been toward chaos, that the jungle will always grow back if we let it. And I think I would argue that some of the drift towards authoritarianism, and indeed the actions by President Putin in recent years, especially recent months, point to this a little bit. And he's challenging in many respects the institutional framework that was set up initially after World War II, the United Nations system, and set up even more directly, I think, and more explicitly in the post-Cold War world. And some of that's reflected in this interesting NATO document. I take about 25 students to Brussels many summers to look at international relations in Brussels. And we visit NATO and we visit the European Union institutions and have European instructors help us with 2 courses on European security and regional conflict and cooperation in Europe. And at one of those visits, they passed out this interesting and complex map, in a sense, a listing or chart of the countries involved in the various institutions that have been established or have grown since especially since the end of the Cold War. And it lists the United Nations, which sort of presents the overall framework. All the states are members of that. The Council of Europe, which you can see in orange there, has a certain amount of members. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, this is an interesting web of institutions that looks to promote security, cooperation, some cases human rights, economic development and prosperity. And to some extent, it's this web of institutions that Putin has begun to challenge. And it's not exactly like he wants to return to the Cold War, I think, but nonetheless, he finds the growth of NATO in particular to some 28 members to be threatening to Russia's security, and he would like to roll it back. So one thing we should keep in mind is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, what was the political situation like in Russia? And it's a very torturous period of the 1990s that we need to remember. But the one thing I want to stress here is that in many respects, the Yeltsin government, as chaotic as it turned out to be, was a working democracy. Part of the challenges that Yeltsin had with his Duma, the legislature there, and the impact of the nationalists and the communists in that body were part of the reason why he wasn't very successful in promoting order and economic development and broad-based prosperity. But elections did matter. In this first election, presidential election in 1991, he won quite handily and was very popular, having put down the attempted coup by the hardliners against Gorbachev. Despite having a difficult time trying to reform the economy and make democracy work, he also won the second election. Now, this was much more problematic. As you see in the first round, he didn't get a majority and was very much in close contention with Zhuganov, the head of the Communist Party. In the second round, with the help of spending by some of the oligarchs who were controlling the economy in many respects and who were afraid of the Communist Party coming to power again, and also the intervention of the US, especially the role of President Clinton, he did get a majority and was reelected. The political and economic situation didn't get much better, and Putin came to relieve him at his nomination in 1999 as acting president. And then in the March 26, 2000 elections, he won a fair, I would argue, and competitive election. He got 53.4% of the vote, so there wasn't a runoff. Again, the communists and nationalists were somewhat important in the competition. But that's when things changed rather dramatically. And as we look at the subsequent elections, he became more popular and elections were less competitive. You can argue that he was popular, he still was popular in Russia, but he progressively began to limit the role of the media and the role of political alternatives that actually threatened it. 2008, when he obeyed the Constitution and stepped down in favor of his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev. He then became prime minister as Dmitry was president for the term. Then he ran again in 2012. This was a contested election to some degree, and it was following some parliamentary elections that were a bit controversial and showed some opposition to him. Not everybody wanted Putin back in power. Maybe they even preferred Medvedev. But there was charges of US interference in this, and that's partly where he began to stress that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State at that time, was his enemy. Most recent presidential election results show him again convincingly winning in a not competitive and probably not at all fair election, with 77% of the vote. So what is Putin up to? And one can talk about that in terms of Ukraine, of course, as we'll mostly talk about today. But there's also his role in Syria and the Syrian civil war in support of Assad. There's considerable maneuvering and pressure in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics, never really recognized by the West, but who became among the first members of the European Union and NATO when they got independence after 1991. What's he doing in Western democracies? Influencing elections, meddling in them to some degree. And his relationship with China and his interest in exploring and normalizing economic activity, including transportation in the Arctic and in trying to control the natural resources of that region. So if we go back to his 2009 national security strategy, which was supposed to be guiding him up to about this point. He stressed the importance of energy security, cited the importance of the Arctic, the Caspian Basin, and Central Asian regions, and emphasized the need for modernization of forces and equipment. And he's done a lot in all of those areas. But he faces the autocrat's dilemma. To be a successful modern state, a leader must modernize and encourage innovation. And one could argue that that's sort of the way President Medvedev began to reform the Russian economy while he had his chance as president instead of Putin. The trouble is, this introduces new ideas, new centers of power into the state. The internet and the social media bring great opportunity for idea exchange and collaborative entrepreneurial activity. But there is also the danger of subversive communication, and it's hard to resist reflex to try to control and block key websites and media, a key Putin aim, and he's been rather effective at it increasingly in recent years. So if you need to modernize and you need to be open in some sense and support independent entrepreneurial activity, and if that's not really working in Putin, which is not a diversified economy at all, certainly not one that has a lot of innovation in the private sector, what does that mean for the economy? How weak is the Russian economy? Is this an Achilles heel for Putin that'll ultimately be severely problematic for him? And we do try to argue that there's some of this certainly in the evidence that we present in the book. And are the Western sanctions hurting? If they're going to be tougher ones, assuming he might still invade Ukraine, will they hurt? Is his system immune to that to some degree? And how does this current sort of kleptocratic or crony capitalist system working for the average Russian? Russia still must export natural resources to survive economically. He does this very well, and Europe is very much dependent on energy supplies from Russia. Is this a viable strategy for the long term? He's missing innovation and competitive manufacturing, where other authoritarian regimes have been able to develop, for example, China. There's been some improvement in agricultural production, maybe as a result of some of the policies he's taken in response to the initial range of sanctions that were instituted after his annexation of Crimea. But it's after long-term neglect and disinvestment. The size of the Russian economy still is less than that of California, New York, or Texas. It's not an economic power, and it's unequal. So one statement by Putin in his national security strategy of the Russian Federation until 2020 was that Russia's national security depends above all on energy security, which relies on Europe's dependency on Russian natural gas and on the economic benefits associated with profits from oil. Russia's principal goals by 2020 are to become the world's 5th largest economy. He didn't make that in terms of GDP, through the profits derived from export of overpriced oil, and to develop into a global power by securing its monopoly over natural gas to the European community. Now, there's a really good book just out by Timothy Fry, I would argue, a Columbia professor of international relations. Wasn't there when I was there, but I think he echoes some of the statements we argue. He's a strong man, there's no question about that, but maybe a weak strong man. The limits of power in Putin's Russia are what he tries to describe in this book. And I'm working on this with my present course on the politics of the USSR and its successor states, with an honors group that are reading it with me after hours. So one of the things about Russia that's really interesting is its geography and what's happened as a result of the dismemberment of the Soviet Union. Here you can see a number of the important successor republics. I guess you can see essentially all of them, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe not Estonia, but Belarus, Ukraine, and of course, Central Asia, which is a primary focus. And it's interesting to think about this in terms of the power dynamics and the regional geopolitics of Central Asia, an area that I'm very interested in, and the struggle between China and Russia in some sense for influence there. I would just argue that Russia in some sense is ceding influence in that part of the world to China, at the same time that Russia and Putin in particular are, focused like a laser on Western Europe and the threat from NATO, the threat from Europe, not the threat from China. So prior to the 2014 crisis, Russian goals to ensure energy security were to prevent European countries from diversifying their sources of energy supply. They've been trying to do that, but they find it also easy and economical to get it from Russia, many of them, especially Germany. 2, strengthen its hold over the international gas market with strategic purchasing of the domestic energy infrastructure of former Soviet states. Now, the influence in Kazakhstan is important there, their influence in Azerbaijan is important there, but these are really independent countries that have established their own deals and their own ways of shipping energy to Europe and to China without going through the Soviet network. So you could argue that hasn't been all that successful, and maybe the Chinese are actually winning out. 3rd, acquire downstream assets in Western countries, including distribution and storage capability. Some of that has happened. It's very complex. There have been some interesting books written on this subject lately. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. And to some extent, it's, I think, threatened by a possible invasion of Ukraine, because Europe's already trying to retain control and become less dependent on Russian energy, and will be pushed further down that line if there is an invasion. Why Ukraine matters? Well, here shows to some extent that until recently, much of the oil and gas pipeline network went from Russia through Ukraine to get to Europe. Now, some of it went through Belarus as well. And increasingly, Russia's tried to cut out or go around Ukraine to the south, through the Black Sea and through Turkey, and through the north, directly under the Baltic Sea to Germany. That's what Nord Stream 2 is all about, a direct pipeline from the Petersburg area, St. Petersburg area to Germany, and eliminating the influence and indeed the potential disruption that Ukraine has in the past and could perhaps exercise in the future in those pipeline transits. So what about Putin and Ukraine? There's a long essay that Putin published last summer to make the case that Ukraine was not ever a sovereign state and is inseparable from Russia. This is part of a long-term strategy to roll back the impact of the collapse of the USSR and reassert influence over successor republics and former Warsaw Pact members. Now, he's done this in an interesting way individually with many of the countries, but it includes a fairly remarkable statement made a couple of weeks ago that he demands a return of Europe to 1997, before independent East European states like Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, etc., and Romania were permitted to join NATO and the European Union. Not to mention former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. If in fact he invades Ukraine, Putin is expected to stage a pretext, what we call a false flag attack on Eastern Ukraine, where the separatists are in control and operating in many respects, and that this would prompt Russian assistance in response to defend the Eastern Ukraine separatists. This is the result, or this evidence, or this expectation is featured in US intelligence reports that have been made public. A little unusual during the course of a crisis for intelligence reports to be made public. But it's partly a US strategy that seems to be relatively effective to deter the actual event, or at least to make sure that the world was not surprised by it, and to be able to plan for it. All this talk with the Europeans about what would the sanctions be, the really harsh penalizing sanctions that they're talking about prior to an actual invasion, is very different from the situation that led to the annexation of Crimea, and yet it's a similar pattern. That is the strategy in some sense, claiming that something wrong is going on, that the local population is being aggrieved, and it would rather be associated with Russia than associated with Ukraine, and so let's help them. And then let's do a plebiscite to see that they are in fact in support of the annexation. You could argue a similar pattern took place in Georgia in 2008. The Russian media has been active these days, preparing the ground for the Russian population accepting this. And the separatists have used this media to plead for Russian weapons. They already have them, probably all they need in some sense, and they have plenty of Russian support, but they're trying to make it look like Kiev is about to attack, and that the Western activity and the Russian aid in arms and economic support and the alarm being raised by the West is just evidence that the West is about to attack, and the Russians need to be ready to help their brother Slavs in Ukraine. Are there unintended consequences of Putin and Ukraine? It's commonly argued, and I think I accept this, that Ukraine was never going to be a NATO member. There were noises about this around 2008. Indeed, the Bush administration seemed to sort of welcome the prospect of Georgia and Ukraine one day joining NATO. But there was clear European resistance to the notion, taking into account Russian sensibilities, I think. And this really must be a consensus decision. So if the Germans and other European countries remain opposed, as they seem to be, they in effect have a veto over this. And it's, you could argue that Zelensky, when he visited actually the White House and with President Biden and requested NATO membership, even Biden said, well, I'm actually quite supportive of this, but I'm not the one making the decision. You know, it's NATO, it's the membership, it's all of them in a sense. So if this is the case, if Ukraine was never going to be a NATO member, so the stated Russian concern and demand on this, I would argue, was largely a smokescreen. And what it's done to some extent is bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. Again, not probable membership, but a special relationship with the European Union that has been underway for some years and maybe is accentuated now. Similarly, one should keep in mind that NATO enlargement was voluntary and legitimate, given East European security concerns, which were sort of heightened by the actions of Russia in Chechnya and some of the other chaos of the 1990s, as well as their own history of being dominated by the Soviet Union. Also, it's a defensive alliance and has no real prospect for launching aggression toward Russia. It responds when it's attacked. And there's a very interesting book by a Stanford historian, James J. Sheehan, that makes this point, I think, very eloquently. It's entitled, "Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? The Transformation of Modern Europe," in which he says that Europe has really become a civilian superstate, and left to their own devices, that is, without any kind of a Russian threat, or maybe even threats from other parts of the world, they would just as soon focus on economic prosperity and social change and not be concerned about arming themselves. But you could argue that NATO has been awakened by Russian activity, not just in Ukraine, but its training exercises in Belarus, its overflights across borders of military training operations in the Baltics, in Scandinavia, in the Black Sea, that cause alarm and have actually increased, along with the demands of the US, defense spending and preparedness in NATO. So in some sense, he's creating the concern that maybe he's voiced when it didn't exist. NATO has been awakened, one could argue, and there's even talk, fairly serious talk in Finland and Sweden about possibly joining NATO. So he's possibly encouraging NATO enlargement rather than diminishing it or rolling it back. You could even argue that the modest steps by the US recently to send forces to Eastern European members of NATO for fear that they will be, that the rollback pledge or demand is in fact serious, and that it's not just Ukraine, it's potentially the Baltics and maybe Romania, maybe even Poland and Hungary. Unintended consequences. So Russia's put a lot of energy and expense, along with Germany, especially the private sector Germany, to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that goes directly from Russia to Germany. One seems clear, or it seems pretty clear, that if there is a large invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that this pipeline's very much threatened. It hasn't actually been certified yet by the Germans or by the European Union. There's a lot of complexity involved in any kind of pipeline politics venture. It's on hold. And indeed, the Germans at times have said, well, it's at least on hold for 6 months. If there's an attack, there have been statements by various Germans, although it's not entirely clear what the final result would be, that Nord Stream 2 would be dead if there was such an attack. And then there's arguments also by others in Europe and indeed in NATO that even if the Germans did ultimately certify it, despite a Russian attack in Ukraine, that it could be disrupted physically by maybe clandestine operations by military forces. The U.S. is ready to divert gas, liquefied natural gas shipments to Europe if Putin turns off the tap. At least that's the reports we're hearing commonly. And there's been some, I think, reinforcement of the post-World War II values of the West, and suggesting that borders can't be changed by force. That's been an understanding, a norm that Europeans and North Americans have viewed as being important since World War II. Is that really the case? Okay, I think I'll just stop there if that's all right, and try to answer some questions you might. I guess I spoke a little longer than I should have, but I'm not going anywhere.
We have one question in the chat asking Dr. Graham, do you have slides or maps? I think it may be referring to more visual aspect to what you're talking about here.
I think I have probably 60 slides that show various aspects of the pipelines and the relationships. We can turn those over, but I'm not sure. Maybe that's something we can talk about later if someone wants to contact me and take a look at them. Some of them aren't very well edited and organized, so probably should stop here. But I certainly if you look every night on the TV, you see where the forces of the Russians are located in the Black Sea, in Donetsk, eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and in Belarus. So it's kind of basically surrounding Ukraine, except for its western border.
Norm, before we continue, would you mind unsharing your screen so that way you can see more people if they...
That would be useful. Let me do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Another question for you, Dr. Graham. How much gas can the US provide compared to European usage?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't think we really know the answer to that. It's interesting, there's been a change in US policy. It's partly the revolution of fracking. You know, many of us have concerns about whether fracking, the revolution in fracking, to be able to draw upon resources that previously were not effectively drilled, has dramatically changed the US balance of energy imports versus exports. And so there was a law against the US exporting natural gas, a law against exporting oil for some time. That's been changed, in part because we're now a net exporter instead of a net importer. You think back to the 1970s, looking at the audience here, and I know Ron Dorr quite well, of course, he might remember the 1970s. When we had energy shortages and there was the fear of being dependent on energy supplies from the Middle East. It's a different situation now. New fields have been found. The impact of the new technology, which seems to be rather safe and not creating earthquakes and so forth, but I still have questions about it, has meant that there's more natural gas in particular than we need for domestic purposes. And the infrastructure has changed. If you look at the ports in the Gulf region in particular, that were set up originally to import LNG from the Middle East in particular, but from other potential suppliers. they've now been changed so that they're capable of exporting LNG. And there are, I don't know the precise flows. I'm teaching a course in international energy policy right now, and I have students who are going to be doing papers on precisely that question. We'll see what the results are at the end. I think there's quite a bit to export, and especially in an emergency situation. And indeed, the US decision makers seem to be planning for diversion of existing shipments to Europe if Putin turns off the tap to Europe.
Another question here.
Question about Turkey.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Did I interrupt someone? Yeah. Okay. If Putin is perceived to back down, would that show of weakness placed on him and any danger from current supporters?
Well, I think that's part of the unintended consequences. I don't think he really expected that the US and the West was going to be so united and so strong in its response, probably, although it's interesting, rather than act quickly begin to move when he first got the idea in his head. If he really wanted to attack Ukraine, he should have done it months ago, probably. And there probably would have been little effective response. There would have been sanctions, but maybe not so dramatic ones. And maybe the Ukrainians wouldn't be so ready to defend themselves. One can argue that, in fact, he already has what he expected to achieve by the fact that he's drawn attention to his long-standing dissent with the expansion or enlargement of NATO, and with a growing relationship between Ukraine and the West, especially under President Zelensky. And so that the West is now aware that he wants his views to be taken into account. And indeed, you've seen this parade of prime ministers and presidents and chancellors going to Moscow and secretaries of state meeting, and President Biden meeting with him on Zoom and so forth, make it clear that he's increased his standing to some degree. He has to be taken seriously. He's drawn attention to his complaint and maybe made it very clear that if it wasn't already, that he is opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership. So he can say, well, I've got the West's attention. They're serious about this. We have some negotiations. It's clear that Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO, although they won't promise that because that would be in contravention of NATO's open door to new members. Nonetheless, there are practical assurances from at least some of the European NATO members that it's not going to happen. Indeed, the US doesn't seem to think it's likely either. So he could gradually draw down his forces. He's always said that he's not going to invade anyway, right? He's just trying to get attention, trying to get some negotiation. I don't think he was serious about the rollback of NATO membership to 1997. It's hard to imagine that happening under any circumstances, but at least it's out there as a talking point.
Are there not other places in the world, maybe the Middle East, that could be a source of LNG for Europe?
Sure. And indeed, one of the things that's interesting about the pipeline politics here is there are already ways in which natural gas and oil get from, of course, the Middle East but also from former Soviet territories like Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Turkmenistan supplies most of its natural gas now goes to China. It doesn't go through the Russian network anymore. They sell some to Iran, but the Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan, BTC pipeline that goes from Azerbaijan and its oil and gas fields to through Georgia, to Tbilisi, Georgia, and then into Turkey, and then into the Eastern Mediterranean, provides a fair amount of energy to Europe already. I think that could be expanded as well. And Saudi Arabia is ready to sell more too. Remember that the dependence, this is the first paper I ever wrote or I ever got published while I was in graduate school at Columbia was one that looked at the early negotiations that Germany was engaged in with the Soviet Union as they were really trying to formulate a final settlement of World War II and to decrease tensions with the USSR and decrease tensions between West and East Germany. And part of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik was to try to trade economic relations for political settlement at a time when Brezhnev in particular was quite interested in earning, the economy was already beginning to suffer, but earning foreign exchange by supplying energy to Germany and to Europe. Something that the US was very much against, because the argument was that Germany would just become dependent on the Soviet Union, and you can't trust those commies. So it's a mistake, but it actually worked in some ways. There were some treaties that came out of that relationship, and the Germans supplied technology for pipeline transmission that the Russians were able to use quite effectively. And the point is that this was in the 1970s, not too long after OPEC had quadrupled the price of oil in the wake of the Yom Kippur War and had instituted a short-term boycott against the United States and the Netherlands. And other Europeans began to take note of this, partly that stimulated expansion of the nuclear energy program in France, but it also pushed other Europeans to think about other alternatives to being dependent on Middle Eastern energy supplies. We had the North Sea oil beginning to be developed. And so there were some readily options, but the stability of Russian supply at that point looked like a good alternative to the Germans, at least, to the instability of the Middle East at that point. So there's still the Middle East. We can expect that shipments from the Middle East would grow probably if Putin turns off the tap, but he doesn't want to turn off the tap, obviously. He can sell oil and gas to China to a large degree, but he's got a good deal that's been arranged. Actually, it's not a good deal for him. There were negotiations for more than 10 years between the Russians and the Chinese that suddenly got settled after the Crimea sanctions were instituted, and Russia began the process seriously of expanding its network of supply to China. That's still in process, and China's got an almost limitless thirst for oil and gas. So it's not as if Russia is necessarily going to be crippled if there is a dramatic reduction in sales to Europe. but I would argue that that's not in its interests, and it doesn't want it likes those euros coming into its coffers, and it doesn't really have much else to sell except weapons. So I think the threat of this trade being reduced or diverted is serious, even though China is a good market for them now.
Another question, where does Erdogan and Turkey stand in this? This individual also always thought that NATO was supposed to be made up of democracies, Poland, Hungary. What are your thoughts on that?
Right, I think Turkey is a very interesting question, and obviously we devote 3 chapters in our book to try to puzzle it out in some respects. And Erdogan's been really interesting lately on this respect. You know, there's a long-term rivalry between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and of course, Turkey joined NATO fairly early on in the post World War II years, in part because it was concerned about Soviet influence on the Bosporus and maybe indeed its own security situation. It's been an active and important NATO member for many years, but Erdogan's taken it in a somewhat different direction, seeking more independence of action. As you may recall, the Soviets, or the Russians rather, have supplied air defense systems to the Turks, and President Trump's reaction to that was, well, of course, not surprising, they went to the Russians because the US under Obama, he argued, I actually don't know the details of this, but he argued that the Obama administration refused to give the latest technology to Turkey, and so they went to the Russians instead. The Russians and the Turks were somewhat cooperative, but also in tension on the Syrian civil war. Indeed, you may recall that the Turks actually shot down a Russian fighter that they believed, or that they accused, had crossed over into Turkish airspace. This led to a flap and a decision by the Russians to cut off its vacation travel. The Turks are very much dependent on vacationers from Russia going to the Aegean Sea ports and beaches of Turkey, and so this hurt them to some degree. But they patched it up and have been congenial at times, but also in opposition at times. And the most recent uptick in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan was interesting because the Turks were fairly overt in their assistance to Azerbaijan this time, and the Russians held off for a time in supporting Armenia, their normal ally in that potential conflict. And one wonders about the Russian-Turkish relationship in that sense. And Erdogan's been active lately, saying that he thinks he can be a broker in this conflict, and has offered to travel to Kyiv and also to meet with Putin. I don't think he's invited, but in an effort to provide some diplomatic response and cover for the Russians, thinking that he can serve as a bridge between East and West, perhaps. I don't think it's working, but it's interesting. He's actually in a pretty weak political position these days, although you can't really rule his ability to stay in power out yet. He historically hasn't had a strong opposition when he's run for election, but now he has some opposition that looks stronger than usual. And in fact, he looks weaker because the economy is tanked so much.
How dependent is Putin on support from the oligarchs to continue his program?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the big things, much of the West looked at Putin in some respects as a savior for the chaos that Yeltsin's Russian Federation had gotten to by 1999. I thought he would be doing two things, which to some extent he did. He would bring back the sanctity of contracts to some degree, so that the deals with Western investors might be protected to some extent. He was going to, and he did, in fact, claw back power from the oligarchs, and the ones that weren't willing to accept his terms were sanctioned in various ways, including prison time, or were banished to the West, living in London. and what he essentially did was to replace the old oligarchs, some of them at least, that Yeltsin was so beholden to, and which he couldn't really effectively control, with ones that he could control and that were actually partners in his enterprise. There's a interesting argument made that Putin is perhaps the exemplar of something called patronal politics. There's a book by a political scientist at George Washington University to this effect, and it suggests that it's kind of a pyramid of power with Putin at the apex, and that he has these interdependent relationships with everyone below him. And as long as he gives his oligarchs and supporters what they need in terms of their own ability to earn and stay in power, they will give him support. It's a mutual dependent relationship in some sense. They're dependent on him and he's dependent on them. And the question is, if he begins to look weak and can't deliver in some respects because the economy has tanked, or something dramatic like the invasion of Ukraine has gone really badly, maybe he's not so strong. I think that's partly the argument that Fry makes in the Weak Strongman book. I'll let you know as my students and I work our way through it.
It has been suggested that Russia should have been helped by a Marshall-like plan as communism collapsed. Would this have been a sound idea? And if so, could it ever have been politically feasible in the US?
Yeah, I don't think it was politically feasible in the US, but one might argue that this was the misstep of the West in some ways. If you actually wanted to have a responsible partner in Russia after the downfall of the Soviet Union, that doing everything possible to give it a chance to actually succeed in a different and difficult environment and in a chaotic political and economic situation, that it should have had something like Marshall Plan aid. And there was aid clearly given to Eastern European countries that were going through similar chaotic transfers. We call this the dual transition to a market economy and transition to liberal democracy. Poland did that rather well with what we call shock therapy, but it was a painful experience and it got a fair amount of assistance from the West to do that. It wasn't that Russia didn't get any assistance, but I think there was a combination of it not being, as you suggest, politically feasible, because after all, the Soviet Union was our enemy, our competitor in the world for most of the post-war period, and it was hard to think of them as a partner, possibly. There was concerned that if they became too prosperous, especially as a result of Western aid, that they might revert into their former great power status and be somewhat aggressive. I think that was short-sighted to the extent to which that was present, but there are some articles and books that make the claim that that's what the Pentagon was thinking, and that's what the Ministry of Defense in the UK was thinking, and so why help them? It's better that they be weak and somewhat chaotic. But there was also an argument. First of all, we provided a fair amount of assistance. We, actually welcomed them into a constructive relationship with NATO in the formation of the Russia-NATO Council. Wasn't membership in NATO, but it was a working relationship that went on for some time and might have well been constructive in improving European and Eurasian security and make them not seem sort of left out and humiliated. But I think there was also just a strong view that we need to just give them guidance, send all these consultants over there and tell them how to fix their economy, right? And send all these NGOs and USAID folks to help them to run elections effectively, to learn how to construct political campaigns and how to make sure elections are fair and that kind of thing. We did a lot of that kind of thing. And by the way, they have all of these natural resources, and they have this supremely educated population. Their technical and scientific departments and universities were regarded as quite high in quality. And if they have all this scientific and technical expertise, plus they have all this oil and gas and timber and minerals, why do they need help from us? Save that help for developing countries that are struggling without such resources, perhaps, and indeed helping the other successor republics that are less well off. So I think there was some of that going on too, but I would argue it was mishandled. And you could argue that there was a certain amount of arrogance in the West, that they were in the driver's seat, that capitalism had prevailed. The end of history argument, there's no challenge in terms of organizing political and economic institutions to what the West has, and the debate's over and they just need to follow that, those prescriptions, the Washington Consensus, strategy for economic development and so forth, and they'll be fine. They don't really need outside assistance. And we weren't necessarily in a good position at that point we weren't as strong, probably in a relative sense economically, as we were coming out of World War II, when the Marshall Plan looked like it was the only way to save Europe from Soviet domination and communist domestic politics.
Another question, Dr. Graham. Will we ever find out what the Trump and Putin conversations were about?
I don't think so, unless Putin spills the beans, or if the KGB releases the tapes. And there's this question of, why is President Trump so apparently supportive of or willing to turn a blind eye to Putin, and make claims that maybe Putin kills people, but we kill people too. I think he said that. Didn't he say something like that? I don't know. I think the fact that some of these meetings, at least, were done entirely under Russian control, in the sense that there was a Russian interpreter for both the president and Putin, and there were no other US officials allowed. I think we never allow our presidents to meet one-on-one like that. with major figures typically. And so it was a big change to some degree. And I don't think we have written records of that. And we're probably not going to unless Putin coughs them up at some point. He doesn't seem to be willing to do that at this stage.
There's a question from the Robertson room.
Norm, you recommended Richard Haas's book the last time you spoke to Great Decisions, and I quickly looked at my copy, and he starts off the book by saying the last time the major powers had peace and stability in the world goes back 200 years to the Congress of Vienna. Fast forwards at the end of the book, quoting Kissinger, that we need a balance of power on one side and rules on the other. It seems to me we've got the balance of power if you consider nuclear stalemate, but we don't have rules. What are some of the building blocks to get to those rules so that the major powers agree on what leads to peace and stability?
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. You know, one of the arguments I like to make in these kinds of discussions is on what seems to be a growing clash of values. If we don't have the same values, it's pretty hard to develop rules that are actually going to work. And you can see one of the things about the about the Russian and China relationship is that they seem to agree that Western values are not for them. And so they respect and obey some of the rules of the UN machinery, but only when it's convenient for them. And I think they're trying to redefine those to some degree. And so they're both members of the World Trade Organization, they're members of the IMF and the World Bank. I'm not sure they think that those institutions, along with the United Nations, are pursuing policies that are in their interests. And so they're looking for alternatives. They seem to be fairly active in looking for an alternative to the world's reliance on the dollar as an important reserve currency. Now, I don't think you can see that likely coming from the ruble, or from the renminbi, but it's interesting. When one of my classes, we're reading a book that tries to look at the impact of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and the extent to which actors that countries and individuals that are not so well treated potentially in their behavior in the normal dollar-based exchange systems and finance systems can develop an alternative of cryptocurrency interactions. I'm not sure the Chinese and the Russians have found a formula that makes them think they can actually control it any better or profit or suffer less. I mean, obviously a big part of the concern that Putin must be weighing at this point is the extent to which the sanctions that have been promised would involve real control over the ability of the oligarchs and indeed Russia in general to access deposits in foreign countries and move money for their private use and for various purposes. Attacking the SWIFT bank system and so forth is regarded as maybe one strategy that the West could employ. We don't know the details of these options, but I think it's interesting to contemplate the extent to which the system that Haas talked about that was in disrepair, either disrupted or in disarray, And we've seen the disruption because of the pandemic and the global supply chain network and the like. What's the alternative to that, right? What can we do to be less disruptive? Have we gone too far in globalization? Do we need to be more national or regional in our organizations? And I think part of what Putin is trying to do is to look for alternatives that would make him less vulnerable to the kinds of sanctions that we're talking about these days. I'm going to turn on my light. I see I'm getting pretty dark here. Just a minute. Now it's probably too light. It looks like I have a halo. Sorry.
Another question for you, Dr. Graham. I may be interpreting this question wrong, but what would sending troops to the Ukraine prevent?
Sending US troops?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I was talking about to my international energy policy class yesterday was the old tripwire solution, right? What's a tripwire? Well, in the case of NATO, this was a situation where the US and the Europeans had no stomach for matching the conventional forces superiority that the Soviet Union had at that point, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, greatly outnumbered Western forces in Europe. And so a conventional conflict clearly would be a non-starter or a non-successful venture for the West. And this was during the period of mutual assured destruction in terms of nuclear weapons, so that we balanced each other pretty convincingly in our ability to destroy each other if nuclear war became about. So how do you, in that circumstance, have a credible defense if your main concern is a conventional attack, maybe exactly like is possible in Ukraine, given the marshaling of forces along the border and so forth? And you don't want to result in nuclear war. And indeed, it's regarded as unthinkable, and maybe as a consequence, it's not going to happen. So does that mean that we just give up Germany? Because we're not ready to develop the same kind of forces that the Soviets have to respond to a conventional attack, which would largely come from East Germany into Germany, West Germany. So the notion was, let's station US troops along the borders or in those countries that are most susceptible to be attacked if there is in fact a Soviet invasion. So they'll be killed first. That would be a tripwire. And it's advertised as such in the sense that the Soviets knew that if they rolled those tanks across the German plains, they'd be resisted by US forces that were already there, who would be the first to die, perhaps. And that would then escalate the situation rather dramatically. It wouldn't just be Germans that were dying, it would be Americans that were dying. And that would improve the credibility of the US threat of a nuclear response to a Soviet attack. Now, we never experienced that. I don't think that's what Biden is really trying to do in this sense, but some of the call to have US troops in Ukraine, or more troops, perhaps more likely in the Baltics and in Romania and in Poland, Hungary perhaps, would at least suggest that if there's an attack on Ukraine, it isn't going any further than that, And these troops also could be useful in evacuating populations, providing humanitarian assistance and so forth, if they're ready there. Now, we're only talking so far about 3,000 new troops going to Europe, but it could be kind of a tripwire, one might argue. Shows the seriousness of the US commitment to NATO, and it's a commitment to NATO, not to Ukraine.
Dr. Graham, we're out of time, but do you have a couple of more minutes to answer some more questions that were posed in the chat?
I think I can. I'm losing my voice, but I'll be okay for a little while longer.
Another question.
Speaking on my NATO cup here.
What significance do the various ethnic quote-unquote minorities of the former USSR and Turkey have an influence on the geopolitical future of Russia and or Turkey?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. Actually, my colleague Timur Kocaoglu would be really good at that because he's a specialist on Soviet and post-Soviet nationalities. He's himself a political scientist who's born in Turkey, but his parents have Central Asian roots, and so he's very much an ethnic Central Asian, you could argue, and he's very interested in that region. And it's challenging in some respects because it's so complex. And part of the issue in the Russian relationship with these countries is the extent to which there are still Russian speaking and maybe ethnic Russian populations in some of them. Kazakhstan, for example, northern Kazakhstan is heavily populated by Russian, well, it's most of the country is Russian speaking, but actually ethnic Russians. And so one of the things that one could argue Nazarbayev did was to establish his northern capital, which used to be called Astana, and now is called Nur-Sultan after him, in order to maintain Kazakh influence in northern Kazakhstan and maybe expand it to some extent and move the population up there so that the Russian enclave was not so obvious or so large potentially. And that situation exists in the Baltic countries as well. And indeed, one of the tensions in some of them is the extent to which the ethnic Russians are treated fairly by the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. Do they have normal citizen rights? Are they really allowed to be citizens if they don't speak Estonian or Latvian? Can they actually vote in those circumstances? And there have been UN and especially European Court of Justice cases and investigations of this. Is this a denial of human rights when the Baltic countries are concerned about destabilizing impact of ethnic Russians in their borders? They could go home, of course, go back to Russia, but they've lived in the Baltics for all their lives, and they probably regard it as home, even if they're not willing to learn that difficult language, Estonian, for example. And I think there's some of that kind of activity in other post-Soviet states. It's certainly an issue in Ukraine, and I think the article that Putin published, which you can easily get in English from just Googling it, speaks to that matter, in which he argues that the Ukrainian language is really not that different from Russian, and their culture is shared, and it's not a sovereign state, and the long history means that they shouldn't regard themselves as separate from their Russian big brother, I guess. And I think many Russians, that's interesting to see some of the public opinion polls out there now, the extent to which they're not controlled by the state, suggests that the average Russian looks upon the Ukrainians as at least sympathetic and like-minded individuals, and they can't imagine them as enemies. And so the way in which the media, and to some extent the spokesperson, official spokesperson of Putin and his ministers, have tried to characterize Zelensky and indeed the Western Ukrainians as out for blood or anti-Russian or the like, isn't really selling very well to the average Russian, to the extent to which they get information. So it's not at all clear that, I actually think one of the unintended consequences is to create exactly what Putin didn't want to happen, which is a sense of national identity among Ukrainians. If they didn't think themselves very different from the Russians in the past, they do now. And so Ukrainian nationalism is much stronger than it used to be. I mean, there's a long history of tension and animosity that one should point to, as well as the close cultural relationship. And you go back to the Stalin efforts to collectivize agriculture and put down the Ukrainian peasantries, which led to great famine that the Ukrainians still remember. There's not entirely a good history of relationship, no matter what Putin tries to say in his essay. But that essay is worth reading, and I think he may have. I don't think the Ukrainians buy his argument, and I'm not sure all the Russians do either.
Could a Russian invasion of Ukraine turn into a repeat of their failure in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think that's worth considering seriously. And I don't know whether you saw the news reports last night, and indeed on Sunday, CNN had a couple examples, for example, of older women, grandmothers, training to use AK-47s because they say if the Russians come, they want to be able to shoot them. It's kind of funny. We think about shooting ranges and we see these burly rural Americans out there with armed to the teeth and so forth. Well, these were grandmothers and young. It reminded me a little bit of the way the British public responded to the Blitz and to the fear of air power from Germany and so forth in World War II. And there was an episode of a young couple putting their young son on a train to leave Kiev to go to the west. I don't know, it was Lviv or one of the other cities, or it was a rural area where maybe they had relatives or something, but it was much like the Londoners sending their children to the countryside to avoid being attacked by the V-1, V-2 bombers and so forth. Anyway, I think it would be a quagmire. That's the problem, right? I think invasions don't work. We should have learned that by now, especially if you've got a relatively well-armed and educated and somewhat effectively supplied enemy. And the one thing that Ukraine has also in many of its major cities is an elaborate network of bomb shelters. And so if they're trying to ride out the initial attack, they may be able to do that. They were developed to ride out the potential attack from the US and NATO during the Cold War. And now they're potentially being used to allow them to survive the potential Soviet attack. and they're much better trained. That is the Ukrainian defense forces are much better trained than they were during the initial attack in Donbass. And indeed, the Ukrainians stopped the separatists in their tracks after a certain point, even when they weren't well trained and weren't well supplied. So I think this would be a calamity for Russia. It's not going to be that popular in Russia, probably, and it's certainly going to inflame world opinion and European opinion. There are going to be economic costs to it as well, and it could be a quagmire. They might be able to go rather swiftly to Kiev. They might even depose Zelensky if he doesn't run and hide in London or something. But it's not going to be easily subjugated, I don't think. We don't need another civil war.
Norm, I'm going to jump in at this point because I'm very conscious of how much of your time we've taken up this afternoon and evening. On the other hand, I never like cutting off questions. So I wonder if, I know that Bard and Judy had asked questions. Would you be okay with them emailing you?
Would I be okay if what?
If they emailed you.
Oh yeah, sure. Sure, that's
Thank
fine.
you very much.
I must admit, though, I'm sort of inundated by student questions since the midterms are about to occur, and I've got some anxious students, but I'll do my best to respond, and it's nice having the opportunity to have this discussion. I wish I had answers.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Norman. That was just massively informative, and yeah,
Thanks.
I was very much appreciated.
Bye-bye.
And just one last word, actually, first of all, Taz, thank you very much for moderating so well on your debut. We very much hope to see you again. And then a brief announcement for this time next Tuesday, something very different. Dr. Anne Larrabee from MSU's English department will be talking about her research in general, particularly a book that I just came across soon after arriving in the States and was mesmerized by. It's all about a Confederate soldier who became what was called the dynamite fiend. It's really, really amazing story. So please come back here next Tuesday. Thank you all. Good night.
That's good. Good night.
Good night.